with songs they have sung for 1,000 years.
ご機嫌いかがですか？渡辺Danです。On today's episode of Alt Cinema combined with Hollywood Rants, we're going to talk about one of the most interesting periods in Hollywood history, and that is the period from 1965 to the early 70s, when we saw Hollywood grappling with a number of very, very devastating changes, such as the falling apart of the production code, the rise of independent filmmakers, and most importantly, the obsession with making very, very expensive musicals and how that put most of the studios on the brink of bankruptcy. Now, why is that important to today? Because a lot of the things that were happening at that time are easily mirrored in what's happening in the industry right now. And no, this does not have anything to do with the COVID virus. It does not have anything to do with what's going on with the riots and the industry's response to all of that. It's instead a look at what the business practices are and how they're following a very dangerous trajectory, which in turn provides an opportunity for all sorts of growth and hopefully good news for people who are entering it right now. Let's start with a little bit of historic context. First of all, 1965 was the last year the production code was actually in full effect. So you still had a lot of censorship, even though it had been reduced quite a bit by just the influx of European movies and just changes in society in general. Now, this was before the baby boomers really came into their power, but they were starting to get a little bit older, starting to get a little bit more mature. A lot of times people will trace this back, instead of The Sound of Music, to My Fair Lady. The truth about My Fair Lady, though, was that they spent a heck of a lot of money acquiring the rights, and Jack L. Warner pretty much gave away all creative impetus toward it. They pretty much had to follow the play word for word, without, and the only exception to that was being able to get certain changes allowed by Alan J. Lerner, and George Cukor, Cecil Beaton ended up getting into a notorious fight. So My Fair Lady, for all of its pomp and circumstance and winning of Best Picture and all of that, really isn't that satisfying a movie, nor, as the historic record will show, was it really a great box office hit. It did well, especially in terms of the amount of money it generated, but relative to its cost, you can't look at it as anything but a major disappointment. On the heels of that, 20th Century Fox had the rights to the most recent Rodgers and Hammerstein show, which was The Sound of Music. It had been a typical hit on Broadway with Mary Martin, but it was certainly not considered one of the great Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. Therefore, the film version of it, which was to be directed by Robert Wise, was going to be something that was relatively low budget. Now, I'm not going to say that Sound of Music was by any means a cheap film, but it was certainly not of the astronomical budget that My Fair Lady was. And to solidify that, it had Julie Andrews in it. Now, Julie Andrews was still coming off of having been supposedly robbed of her chance to play Eliza Doolittle in the film version of My Fair Lady. But she had been a sensation in Mary Poppins, an Americanization of Emily, so she was definitely a star on her rise. But the contracts for her were signed before Mary Poppins was released and everything else, so they had no idea how big she was going to be at that moment. The Sound of Music, from the very beginning, was criticized as being very saccharine as a show, and to his credit, Robert Wise and screenwriter Ernest Lehman, and producer Ernest Lehman, pulled back a lot on some of the saccharine elements and added a little bit of toughness to it. Now, how tough can you be with nuns and children? Actually, it's a lot more tough than a lot of people give it credit for today, especially those who have not seen it. What is Sound of Music about if you strip it down to its base elements? It's all about the ability for people to escape from oppressive regimes through the use of music. And we see during the course of the movie that the Maria character, the nun, is a rebel. She fights against the oppression of the convent. She fights against the oppression of Captain Von Trapp. And in the process of it, she of course melts his heart. She of course wins over the kids. And she teaches them to do that through music. Now, one of the weird connections with the Sound of Music that a lot of people don't think about consciously, but it's definitely there, is the fact that the teenage audience who went to the Sound of Music and loved it were those same kids who would 5 years later be extremely rebellious and would be part of the counterculture movement. And in fact, they would embrace Easy Rider. Now, what is Easy Rider? Am I going to say Easy Rider is a child of the Sound of Music? Yes, I'm going to say that exactly. Why? Because they're really similar stories. They're both about people who have rebellious intent, who go on a journey and experience life in a way they never imagined they would. They find self-actualization, and all the while there's a music soundtrack in the background. What else do the two have in common? They both have a strange subtext of being able to use music to fight everything but an oppressive regime. Now, what happens in The Sound of Music? Well, the Nazis invade, and Maria and the Von Trapps end up having to escape. And there's one very telling scene as they're hiding in the convent's graveyard. There's a moment when the little girl, Gretel, asks her mother, Mother, should we sing about our favorite things? And Maria answers, no, we must be very quiet. We see the exact thing that happens if you don't follow that advice, that sometimes you cannot be loud in your happiness. And that is when, in Easy Rider, you have the two hippies go up against the truck driver, and what does he do? Because they weren't quiet, because they didn't let him be, he blows them away. So the Sound of Music's message, which is buried somewhat, is that music does solve a lot of life's issues, but there are some times when you need to cut and run. Now that sounds defeatist, but certainly the Von Trapps ended up having quite the career, and certainly they ended up making a lot of money on the Sound of Music. Whereas in Easy Rider, those people who fought back ended up dead and weren't able to achieve any kind of apotheosis later. The success of The Sound of Music was astonishing. It beat the box office of, at that time, still reigning champion Gone with the Wind. And it played in its first issue all the way until the 1970s. This would, in fact, cause its star, Julie Andrews, no amount of stress, because she found herself in movies like The Early Modern Millie, and especially Star, the second movie we're going to examine today, to be competing against herself. What today is the analog for The Sound of Music? I'm going to say that going back a few years, we can look at, in terms of Disney, their decision to relaunch the Star Wars franchise and the initial success they had with The Force Awakens. You had something that was very, very plain and almost old hat, being able to capture audiences on a wave of nostalgia in a similar way that The Sound of Music had been able to. It looked like it was creating another economic paradigm, but there was a fatal flaw in the construction of The Force Awakens, and that is that there was a reliance on history, but no attempt to really update it. And in that, there were the seeds of a destruction that would come later. Another similar thing is that a whole new market had arisen, and that was the market that was created by streaming. And we see Netflix being able to triumph with something like House of Cards, which was an expensive show, and it was done in a very innovative way. And because streaming was new and unique to Netflix, it was able to create a wonderful new business model that looked like it would be entirely sustainable, because who knew what else would come, what other competition might be there for Netflix. So within both what Disney was doing with The Force Awakens and what Netflix was doing with House of Cards, we see an innovation that is allowed to move forward and create a lot of money, the same way The Sound of Music did. That lesson would be mislearned by the rest of the industry. Now let's cut to 1968. You still had a lot of musicals being made. In fact, you have Oliver winning Best Picture, a movie that today as much as I like Carol Reed's direction and as much as I like the performance and the style in it, it's hardly a memorable movie. You look at what else came out in 1968, in particular things like Rosemary's Baby and all that, and you look at Oliver, and it's the weakest of the nominees that year. I mean, certainly there's parts of Lion in Winter I don't like now, but it's strong. And obviously, if you're going to go for a musical that made an impact and would have a lasting shadow to it, it would be Funny Girl, which proved that the musical still had some life in it if you had the right piece of talent attached. But maybe Funny Girl was too much of a threat. I don't know. Maybe the situation with Oliver is that it was a safe choice. It wasn't introducing a new talent really, and it had that kind of virtue of being based on a Dickens story. The film that we're going to look at is Star with Julie Andrews. Star is very indicative of what happens when a genre stops being looked at as being successful because of the result of all of its elements, chief among them story, and starts getting particularized into certain elements of the genre. In the case of the musical, it became assumed that the audiences were going to see the movies because of their big production numbers, because of the spectacle that was involved. So production numbers were getting longer and longer and longer, and not necessarily germane to the story. And in the case of Star, this was absolutely ruinous. If you look at Star, it's gone through a very interesting transformation. In the 60s, it was a tremendous failure. By the 1990s, its filmmaking quality and the fact that it had been unavailable to see in any form for so long, except for very, very truncated TV prints made out of, shortened from the 2-hour cut down of the film, there was a hunger to see it. And for a while there, it was getting released in revival houses. They did a nice restoration on Laserdisc, which for who knows what reason wasn't used for the most recent DVD, because it was certainly superior to the transfer on that. But now, looking at Star, it feels heavy, it feels pretentious, it feels boring. And in spite of the fact it has good work everywhere in it, it's not a movie that people feel comfortable visiting over and over and over again. It isn't a Rodgers and Hammerstein movie. Why? Because it's perhaps too experimental. It looks at Gertrude Lawrence's life in a non-sequential way. And sure, Funny Girl had come out the same year, and so Star biographies were all the rave. And you also had Isadora, which I guess you could consider a musical too. That was also a tremendous flop. But the bad part about Star was it was about Gertrude Lawrence. And while Gertrude Lawrence was known to the Broadway crowd and known to more high-end aesthetes as being someone who was quite special, when you look at the film, she's not a pleasant character. And Julie Andrews, who by that time was thoroughly branded as Little Miss Fix-It, Little Miss Happy, it was the wrong role. She was playing someone quite skillfully, in fact, but no one wanted to see her in drunken scenes. No one wanted to see her being unsympathetic. No one wanted to see her harder side as being irresponsible financially or being a bad mother. So the stuff about the movie that was intriguing when it was first rediscovered now feels out of place. And it was one of the reasons the film failed initially, because audiences didn't want to see this new iteration of Julie Andrews, and 20th Century Fox spent so much money on it without seriously considering who the end user was. Yes, the time was the beginning of the counterculture. You started having all sorts of more adult-themed movies coming in and breaking a lot of Hollywood's rules. Remember, this is 1 year before Midnight Cowboy, an X-rated film, wins Best Picture. But that didn't mean people who went to see musicals wanted to see this. There was a complete lack of connection between what the film was and who its audience should be. So its failure is not only something that we should have expected; it should have been inevitable. And yet the bosses were so caught up in you could make any musical and it would work that they weren't paying attention to the evidence that was around them. And that included the disappointments that were there with Dr. Zhivago, not Dr. Zhivago, Dr. Dolittle, and Camelot, which kind of was the end of Jack Warner's career. I mean, he had trouble because of My Fair Lady, but certainly when Camelot bombed as big as it did, that was a problem. And so what is the modern analog today? The modern analog today is to look at what happened with Disney when through Lucasfilm they made The Last Jedi. Here you have a movie that, like Star, attacked its core audience. It was against what they went to the movie for. And the studio felt that so arrogant about its own hegemony in the marketplace, its arrogance as being the most powerful studio in Hollywood, to actually go out there and say, well, no, we don't care about our old fans, we don't need them, we're going after younger people, and younger people feel the force is female, and the hell with our installed base. And it got worse and worse and worse. The film still made a lot of money, but it certainly hurt the reputation of the entire Star Wars franchise, and it made the audience very suspicious of what was going to come next. And unlike Star, where 20th Century Fox obviously got the message and said, okay then, we went the wrong direction in that, so when we do Hello Dolly, we're going to make sure we don't screw up the same way again. And where does this tie in with Netflix? Well, Netflix, based on the success of House of Cards, started becoming this very Beverly Hills Hotel Polo Lounge version of a studio. Instead of slowly building and becoming stronger and stronger and stronger the way HBO did, it immediately jumped into we're the high-end people in town. And they became notorious for spending more than any other studio would for every single position in a production, just so that they could get the top material. It also meant that they were buying things willy-nilly without looking at them and seeing if they fit in with their audience brand, because they were growing. And at that point in their maturation, the assumption was it doesn't matter what our profit and loss statement is, it only matters what our growth cycle looks like. So they were spending, like, to use an old phrase, drunken sailors on a shore leave. So there was no responsibility in a lot of the things they greenlit. Two of the things that I've looked at from Netflix personally that just infuriated me, but they're not the main ones, but they're indicative of where they're going wrong. They're indicative of the same mentality that led to Star 40-something years earlier, 50-something years earlier. And that is that that they would do something like House on Haunted Hill, which totally violated the Shirley Jackson novel, the Julie Harris movie, and this is a big statement, the 1999 John Beaumont version. I mean, who would have thought that you could do worse than that? But this film did, because it went totally against audience expectations of the story, the source material, and everything else we had about haunted houses. And the new Dracula takes that to an even worse level, where there's an attempt to make Dracula somehow conform to modern realities and modern social constructs. And it doesn't work with something that was written in the Victorian era. Okay, now we're going to come to point number 3, and that is Hello Dolly. Now, Hello Dolly was one of the huge sensations on Broadway. 20th Century Fox bought the rights to it while it was still in its initial flush. So we're talking about before the big disaster musicals had started happening. And they made the correct decision to bring in Barbra Streisand, who, even though this was pre-Funny Girl's release, everyone knew that Funny Girl was going to be a hit because her footage was sensational. She was a star doing specials on TV, and she actually had a lot more going for her than Julie Andrews did. And even though she was horribly miscast in this, because Dolly Levi should be someone in their 40s, if not 50s, and here's Barbara Streisand, all of 27, starring in this film. Now, she does a good job of it. She kind of does a Mae West impersonation, and the director of it was Gene Kelly. Now, hiring Gene Kelly was probably a mixed bag. On the one hand, Gene Kelly certainly understands the musical. He certainly understands how to do a production number well, especially if it's more athletic. But that in turn was a problem with it. Why? Because Gene Kelly was so focused on the athleticism and the macho side of dancing that he ended up putting in more production numbers that were necessary that showcased the athleticism of a lot of the performers. And this led to the film not spending enough time on Streisand, whose greatest talent was not her dancing, but was her voice. So you have a movie that becomes very heavy because it has extra scenes that do not feature your main performers in it, but are just there for spectacle. Bob Fosse would make the same mistake with Sweet Charity, where he would throw in, the year after, where he would put in big production numbers that featured people we didn't care about, and ultimately bored the audience early in the film's runoff. Now, Hello, Dolly, seen today, holds up beautifully because now, for all intents and purposes, it might as well have been a musical movie made in the 1940s because the average viewer is going to see it as part of this old movie universe. And certainly Streisand does knock it out of the park with her charisma, despite being miscast. And Walter Matthau is absolutely appropriate as Horace because we know that he and Streisand hated each other, and that animosity and her obsession with stalking him into marriage should not make sense, but instead it does. It works on showing how attraction can come from even people who are antagonistic toward one another. So it works on that level. Its length works against it. Hello, Dolly made money, but it lost, made money in terms of box office, but it lost in terms of the amount that was invested in it. It cost too much money for something that was that long. And by this stage in the game, with its competition being Midnight Cowboy, with its competition being far more mature films, felt like an anachronistic throwback. Beautiful production, all that. Families certainly liked it compared to a lot of the other things because it was a safe movie. You could go and see it and not worry about it being too adult or something like that and being a surprise. Nevertheless, what Hello, Dolly did was it put 20th Century Fox, which had been saved from the disaster of Cleopatra by Sound of Music, by Valley of the Dolls, by certain of its other movies that seemed to have made a fortune out of nowhere, through squandering it on bigger movies like Star, Dr. Dolittle, and of course, Hello, Dolly. So it was once again on the tenterhooks. Fortunately, in 1970, they had two hits back-to-back, which were about pretty much the same thing, but seemed to come from different points of view, and that was Patton and MASH. Who would have thought that those two movies would be from the same studio, and both would be nominated for Best Picture, and both of them would make a bloody fortune at the box office and pretty much keep the doors open at Fox and ultimately help them build back their money to where by the time Star Wars came out in '77, they were once again at a peak and able to handle this sudden influx of cash. And by the way, you notice that since Star Wars came out, 20th Century Fox has never been in a risky position. But let's see where Hollywood is right now. And that is, there is no answer. Hello, Dolly led to 20th Century Fox knowing how to manage itself fiscally moving into the future. But I'm seeing Hollywood having been given this opportunity to regroup at least a little bit and consider how they were leveraging assets in this time when the industry is shut down is, instead of really taking a look at its bottom line, is instead still dancing as if the fiddler was still there and there wasn't a problem in the room, that the Red Death hadn't entered the ball. And yet the Red Death has entered the ball. The Red Death has come in and said, guys, you have been spending too much money. And look at what's happening. If you look at the outside, you see Disney, because it no longer has the money from its theme parks, roughly $30 to $40 million a day in revenues, not profits, but revenues, all of a sudden being looked at, all of a sudden being judged by Wall Street as being worth less than Netflix, even though they bought 20th Century Fox, or most of 20th Century Fox. How can that be? It's because the revenues from the parks had hidden a host of other sins. Plus, the results for Disney Plus have been, while not bad, certainly not what they were anticipating, especially when you have so many people stuck at home. Why did they lose 40% of their subscriber base when Mandalorian went off and haven't been able to rebuild it? There's something wrong here. And yet they spent $75 million to get the rights to Hamilton. Now let's see how this new version of Hamilton works. I have my doubts about that. And look at Netflix. Now Netflix has been given the 20th Century Fox gift of MASH and Patton. And what do I mean by that? I mean that during the shutdown, we have seen Netflix's numbers steadily start growing again. So they're moving out of that period where their subscriber base was shrinking and their costs were mounting. The other thing that's come up is that in spite of all the competition from HBO Max, CBS Plus, Disney Plus, all of these other streaming services, that they're still the one that people go to. And what is the other thing that Netflix has done, even though it's slow right now? They're talking about bringing back shows like Unsolved Mysteries. They're talking about bringing back things that on the surface look like, well, we still have an industry shutdown. It's not safe to do big productions right now, so we're going to have to revert to things that don't need large crews and reality and all of that, reality-type programming. The most important thing is this programming is cheap. This is what Netflix needed. Cut your budgets. We also know that Endeavor, getting rid of a third of its agents, has less to do with them just being temporarily stymied. And because Netflix, I'm conjecturing here, but Netflix has probably said, we're not going to buy every single package you give to us with a big element with an unsustainable budget attached. We are going to be more fiscally responsible. That's exactly what Fox did in the 70s. That's exactly what Netflix is doing now. I see Netflix, which I had been very bearish on, as being a company that finally took a look at its bottom line and said, enough. So once again, by looking at historical trends that have happened in the past, we can see analogs to what's happening in Hollywood today. Do I know what's going to happen next? Absolutely not. Am I hopeful? Absolutely. Because out of destruction, of bad thinking, of just throwing everything out there and assuming that there's going to be money no matter how bad your decisions, when that goes away and there's an appreciation for return on investment again, that's when the industry comes crackling. Expect a renaissance to begin now.
Oh, I should have said so long.